Future of urban living. So I was thinking about this, obviously living through COVID, as we all are. It's obviously been quite dreadful for clear reasons. But I think it also gave us a real opportunity to experience and see our city in a very different light. So here in London, in the first lockdown, we experienced roads suddenly without any traffic. We were able to, where I live, I was able to walk freely across streets. And suddenly I felt I was in Holland or in Copenhagen, and there was a whole civil, it became much more civil in London. And I think it gave us a glimpse of optimism. And I think I've seen through Europe, some countries or some cities in particular grab hold of this opportunity and really use it as an opportunity to change our cities, because in particular traffic and cars have really turned our cities into something that needs to be addressed. In London, we have huge issues with air quality, pollution, due to the density and quantities of cars. And we have significant issues in terms of just safety and how we get about our city. But I think it wasn't only that, there was many other levels to it. But I think we would all like to see out of COVID come a real opportunity for change. And it's interesting that a lot of conversation has been given, and this is just a diagram on the left showing the pollution levels pre-COVID in that belt around Beijing, this kind of industrial heartland of China. And what happened when all of that production stopped. And then that kind of led on to conversations and dialogues that this was a matter of choice and not necessity. Something I wouldn't agree with. I think globalization is a clear necessity for lifting many millions of people out of poverty. And it's a complicated issue. And of course, what was great is it demonstrated the cost in terms of carbon and pollution. And that's something that China is looking to address, and something that we all need to start addressing in a much more constant fashion. And so I think this diagram is really just showing, obviously China first, then Europe and the States and everybody, how that necessity will come back in terms of the returning to work, and the pollution levels will go back up. And our way of working in our occupation, I mean, there is obviously a lot of dialogue about whether this throws significant doubt on the idea of towns and cities, and I don't think it does. I think cities have faced these issues before, whether it was fire or disease, going back many centuries, and we've always looked and found solutions and overcame it. But out of it, you would expect, as I was saying, this optimism and this hope and the real political momentum to see significant changes and quick changes in our cities, and not this constant lag and this constant need to compromise and dilute everything to the point of having no effect at all. And I would really hope for an acceleration. And again, I think for obvious reasons, a single party state, China is really going to be showing the way. And I think for us, we have seen immediately a pickup. There's no sitting back in China. So luckily for us, we were very well placed in China. We have an office in Hong Kong. We have an office in Beijing. We've been there for the last 20 years. And so like the last recession, this recession again, the Chinese, for them, they jump in immediately. It becomes a stimulus in terms of pushing capital projects, and this is one. So these are commissions that we have picked up in China in the COVID period. Some of them began beforehand. This is a stadium for their next Asian World Cup. or later in the 2020s. It's in Cheyenne, this historic city, so it's kind of based on temples, but it is showing the confidence of China. We also got this commission for Oppo. I don't know if you know Oppo, a large telecoms mobile manufacturer in China. This is a very extravagant office building in Shenzhen, which is really expanding at such a phenomenal rate. And for this project, of course, this is not a kind of standard in terms of replication. This is a client looking to do something really unique, pushing the boundaries of glass. These will be insulated units, but they will be double curved and single curved, etc. So, but we're also doing a lot of other types of work, which is much more rationalistic and repetitive and efficient, but also looking to capture the kind of key characteristics we see in urban development in China, which is optimism, which is looking at mixed use. This is a techno park, and we've done several of these current designs, all progressing at a pace, looking to create mixed use urban quarters where you're creating office spaces, living spaces, retail, recreational spaces, and all on the basis of everybody coming together in this new urban quarter, which is very much based on density. And also for us, in terms of how we were responding in terms of design, it's the briefs coming forward. We're also focused on the humane aspect, the incorporation of nature, that these are walk cities, cycle cities. And so they're very human focused, and the scale, even though the density is there in the background, it's mixing the two. And we have done similar work elsewhere. This is a commission we picked up, one lucky to win in Budapest, also mixed use on the edge of the city, mixing residential with office and retail. And so all of this, I think, is really for us looking at the city, and I think I just want to talk today not only about the subjective aspects, because this is what we always talk about. What is the narrative? What is the poetics? How we approach the scale, the massing, the materiality, why this is appropriate, why this is more than just pure function, how it gets to emotional level. But there's obviously a bigger crisis facing us, which is the climate crisis. And I think for once, architects can talk on an objective basis from project to project. And it's something that we are starting to have to look at as an office. And we're obviously looking at it from a point of view of an office that needs to do a lot better. So I'm not in any way pretending that we are an exemplar, but I don't think very few are. But it gives me great hope when I see the mayor of Paris really grab the initiative out of COVID, introducing the 15-minute city, which I think we all know about, but really acting on it and really implementing it and really looking to go and start to change Paris. And I think there's real widespread support for it. And I think I would find that throughout many cities. And the only reason this hasn't happened in London to such an effect is because of the way the London mayor is financed. Coincidentally, one of my partners, Patrick Schumacher, did a kind of study based on walking and how certain walk distances could connect the city together. And but again, what was really impressive about Paris is the fact that it's almost going out in the night, transforming roads which were 2 lanes for cars, immediately taking over half of it for cycle lanes. And I think this really shows you this kind of the spirit of which we really need to tackle this and to turn it into a positive. This is a positive for how we occupy and get about our cities, and we really need our politicians to work with us and take this moment to really work with us to change our cities. And I think we're all aware, or I hope we're all aware of the UN IPCC report calling for action by 2030. And we think it's hugely significant that China is putting its weight into this and talking about being net zero by 2060. And we will, in all of those projects start to see this become more and more of an issue in China, and hopefully we see this elsewhere throughout the world. And it's uncontestable, the amount of work that has to be done. And this is just looking at the split between, and clearly most of this is in the production of energy, and then obviously you go on to agriculture. But you can see down the bottom, the energy in use in buildings at 17.5%, which if you add in the actual energy that's used in buildings, I know sometimes this 40% is used against the built environment. I personally find this a little bit misleading, because actually half of that is plug-in loads, such as the cooking or the computers. The other half, or the other quarter of that, is actually rail and roads. So as much as I wish to beat up architects and contractors, they can't be beaten up for all of this, but they're still significant. And what's more significant is that obviously about 6% is new builds, but 17% is due to existing fabric. And a lot of focus needs to be put on that, to not be demolishing buildings and to be refurbishing the existing buildings that we've got to a higher standard. And it's for all of those reasons that we signed up to the UK Architects Declare, not because we thought about a greenwash or we thought about it was good for PR, none of those things. We thought about it really to create another stick for which people can beat us, because there are plenty of sticks already, but this one we actually believe in. And this one, it's for us really to be constantly reminded that we need to do better. This is the only reason we added our name to this, and any profile that we've got is really to push ourselves to do better. And from that, we've started to undertake a review of our past projects, our current projects, and our future projects. It's quite clear that all of these certifications are no longer ambitious enough. What has been quite good is this document, and I'm sure each country has an equivalent, but the RIBA, for once, actually produced a succinct, short, 4 to 6 page document that actually outlines clearly what we need to do. And it's clearly on operational energy and embodied carbon. And on those two factors, and all the rest of the stuff that you get sucked into on LEED about biodiversity, and all of this is really, really secondary or tertiary, or it's way down the list compared to these key carbon areas of consumption. And I would really recommend this document because it's very, very clear. And so for us, we've started to look at this, and one of the issues for us is that we work in a diverse range of regions, from Europe to Asia to the States, etc. And of course, all of that could give us an excuse. We could constantly say, well, the statutory requirements are there. We find it very difficult to persuade clients, and all of that is true. But this is universal. The climate crisis is a universal matter that goes beyond any site boundary, and we are now duty obliged to have this conversation, which, no matter how difficult it is, in all different regions with all clients. And so these are some of our projects that we just finished in the last year, but each of them we're looking at them, and obviously the first one is the large airport we finished in Beijing. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of, I think mainly just within the architectural community, but I could be wrong, of aviation and architects' involvement in aviation. But I would make the argument that aviation is key to globalization. It's key to lifting people out of poverty. Aviation will continue to expand, and it needs to address its carbon footprint. But I don't believe in this purist point of view that you start to cut off areas of our activity and say, no, we're not being involved in that. And then you remain in your ivory tower and you somehow don't engage with the world. I think we don't believe in that, but we do believe that obviously aviation has a lot to do. Same with national and international sporting events. So this is the stadium we just finished in Qatar, a beautiful thing, part of a beautiful football tournament. And we will still want these types of tournaments where people come together and congregate And as a world and as a community, these are immensely useful for intercommunication. And in this stadium, this was a program that wanted to address carbon, and it was a discussion. Unfortunately, in the end, one of the key aspects addressing that was not implemented, which was the use of timber. This is an office building that we've just completed in Beijing. I think I'll go through these quite quickly. But all of these, and actually this project we've done for Penta Investments in Bratislava, is a good example of a low carbon design where through both what the client wanted to achieve in terms of budget, but also in terms of technique, we were really looking at glazing ratios, which are 50-50. So it's balancing high rise, which obviously has impacts in terms of what you pay as a premium for the structure, but it's the insulation and the quantity of glass is kept to a minimum to avoid overheating and the excessive use of cooling. And this is just another project we completed in Nuremberg. I'll go through, but also a project we completed in Hamburg. And all of these, we have to get to look at them, particularly from the embodied carbon point of view. And again, sand, gravel, crushed rock, which is obviously the key aggregate ingredients of concrete. And again, we don't participate in this point of view that you could somehow replace concrete with timber, or you could replace it with stone, which is a ludicrous argument. And the issue with concrete is just that it's so immensely successful as a material. It takes local sand and gravel, mixes it with cement, okay, which has to come imported usually, and then, but it's success at actually using that and being cost effective and efficient, and there is ways to address it which needs to be done. Of course, the starting point in any project is to reuse structures, and we see far too much demolition happening. If I just think about the UK in particular, there seems to be a rampant participation by architects to particularly demolish post-war modernist buildings on the pretense of upgrading them for performance. So whilst this is a project we did in Antwerp, retaining a building that looks Victorian or post-century, but actually it was built after the war, I would really make the argument against any architect who's involved in the demolition of post-war buildings, because it seems to be. But we have looked extensively at the use of timber, but there is a degree to which its use just from pure efficiency in terms of structural efficiency, it reaches kind of capacity issues. And this is looking at glulam and CLT planks. And when you start to look at it for offices where you have long spans, it becomes heavy and clunky. And I would really say hybrids where you're using steel or concrete and then combined with timber. And I know many architects are looking at this. But there is a downside to timber, which is that it is something that, unless it comes from a renewable source, feeds into all of these issues, from deforestation to the urbanization that comes in its wake. And unless timber is coming from a certified renewable source, and unless it's traveling a short distance from where it is sourced to where it's being used, you're just adding up the carbon. So it's not this easy calculation that you take out concrete and you just throw timber in as a word. But if it's traveling halfway across the world to get to where it needs to be used on site, it's a false economy. And of course, unfortunately, we had a significant fire in a high-rise building, which had nothing to do with timber, but timber is actually going to be one of the main consequences of what comes out of the regulation change in the UK due to the Grenfell fire in 2017, which is very, very unfortunate. It looks likely they will be setting a height limit in the UK of 18 meters, above which it'll become a very, very difficult issue to argue with local authorities. And it is an overreaction, because on the right-hand side, you see this fantastic high-rise timber project in Norway, and it shows you what's capable, what's possible, fully fire engineered and very, very safe. But we ourselves have looked at using an old timber. This came out of our multiple stadium iterations. We found a client that wanted to do the most sustainable stadium. So we proposed to him, why not do everything in timber? Not only the roof structure, which is obvious, but also the rakers, the seating terraces, using glulam and CLT, and been able to do so to create something that looks appealing, that's not wearing its credentials on its sleeve, but actually is dynamic and attractive, but also uses very traditional techniques of the twin column with the beam, but creates something. But even this project, which is to be based in Britain, will face issues of where this timber comes from, because nobody in the UK makes engineered timber like this. So we will have to factor in getting this from France or Austria or wherever, unless somebody in the UK starts to produce it, and I hope they do. But at the moment, that would be something that needs to be factored in. And then this is part of the low carbon review that we did. So on the right-hand side is two of our recent towers, one in Milan and the one just in Beijing. And then we just compared it using the help of Max Fornham's engineers with the embodied carbon in two landmarks in London. The Leaden Hall one, which is the more recent one on the far left, and then the Gherkin, or the St. Mary's Axe, as its proper name is. And it's a little bit unfair, because the Gherkin, or St. Mary's Axe, is actually a very innovative tower project using atriums, etc. But it is really just looking at the embodied carbon in these projects. Surprisingly, we did well in Beijing. The Milan project did best because it used recycled aggregate from the buildings that it crushed on site. So there was no transportation, and the concrete was made on site, which is why it did so well. But it just shows you, if you then look at the targets of actually all of these buildings are just about, well, the two projects by us are just about hitting the RIBA 2020 target. We might scrape in with the 2025, but 2030. And that really just shows you what's ahead of all of us. If all of us are, this is not something that should be the exceptional. This is something that if we are to do what the UN is telling us, and if we are to see off this increase, and if architects and the built environment is to do its bit, we are going to have to reach these targets for every building, not the exceptional tower in Milan. And so this is the message that we are taking internally, that this is a huge issue. And of course, we can't get away, like I was saying, our concrete, or the use of concrete, has been fundamental to our practice. We believe the very fact that it is so common, it is why it is such a contemporary material. And it's not something, but we have looked at using cement replacements, or in this case, looking at using GGBS, and also using recycled aggregates. And I think very successfully to get the kind of fair face finish that when you strike it, it has this blue kind of hue to it. And then over time, it returns to the normal grayish tones. So we found it to be this was the first project we did in 2012 using the specification. And now for us, we need to try and use this for every project where we're using concrete. And in the UK, we've been able to do so. This is a project we did in Oxford. And I think really the challenge for us is to start to persuade this to happen in China and other markets where we're operating. And it brings us on to the other issue, which is the airtightness and the level of insulation. I think these are key factors of pushing beyond what's in the regulations, and also then testing how you achieve it. So this is a project we did in Glasgow. Okay, it's a big shed, which is why this infrared camera shows it to be working so well. There's very few openings. But on this, we achieved quite a good air tightness, just for the sake of the fact that there was very few windows. But what kind of key to us is that going forward, that level of air tightness you'll have to achieve on all types of building, offices and residential buildings with many, many types of openings. And of course, the key to it is the quality of construction and the thought and accuracy that goes into the detailing, and likewise into the construction, which is why it's so interesting to see the off-site manufacturing discussions. But of course, the frame and the structure is where a lot of the energy is used. This is a similar project to Milan that we completed in Marseille with a double facade. Again, the concrete, but the double facade, unlike the Milan tower, was not a ventilated facade. This is just a naturally ventilated outer glazed screen, which significantly cut down the solar gains and allowed us to use chill beams, which is the first time the chill beams had ever been taken from Northern Europe and used in the Mediterranean. And again, just following through in terms of this has been completed since 15, and we've been back, and the chill beams and the overall energy consumption, the client is really very happy with both how the chill beams are working and the double facade and the level of reduced energy that they're having to pay for and use in the building. And it's something that we took on to a project when we have a commission to do a tower bank, the central bank of Iraq. So obviously, even in a more extreme climate than the Mediterranean, and looking at using fins to reduce the amount of solar gain while at the same time balancing that with daylight. And it's really the analytical side to this and understanding the metrics and being aware of this and feeding that into the design. It still didn't stop us from creating a very iconic, complicated facade, which is on site at the moment. And I take the criticism that this is using too much materials. And again, it is something that we looked at for a project in London, is using a kit of parts and how those kit of parts could be put together in the most efficient way. So the overall kit between glass and precast creates the depth, the shading, the low glazing to solid ratios so that you have an overall low carbon design, but also doing it with the most efficient use of materials. And for us, it's an overall constantly moving circle of all of these components. But I think this, for us at the moment, is something that we're really giving a lot of thought to and self-criticism to do a lot better on this and to take this into our projects as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really thinking about your starting point, that how globalism can lift the whole poverty problem to a better level, and the buildings that you have shown us are really the other end of the world in this way. So how do you think that this high-end architecture can somehow drip the efforts down to the lowest levels of humanity? I mean, this kind of building is expensive, so
which ones? So they're not all expensive. So, and they're not all at one end of the market. I think we have done a range of buildings in a range of different contexts, and I think everybody deserves architecture to do more than just be some functional object for shelter and a place to sleep or a place to work. And we've done a school in the one of the most deprived areas of London. And we've done, I mean, there's a whole list, and our whole portfolio was built on public projects, won through public open competition tenders. It wasn't something that we were some kind of luxury stars. We went in, and we still do this. And this is our still main interest. And our kind of main calling card was always to try and open up buildings, whether it's the building in Cincinnati or Wolfsburg or the Aquatic Centre in London, all trying to open them up to engage the public and to make buildings more accessible for everybody. And then, of course, from there, we springboarded to doing more private clients. I mean, it's still a fact that some of those are private commissions, but we are still an interest in the public engagement. And so I wouldn't, and I think I showed there okay, we're doing offices at the moment for OPPO, but OPPO employs thousands of ordinary people. That's one way of looking at it, but also we're doing these techno parks and urban regenerations, not only in China, but in Budapest, in Prague, in London, in Bratislava. And we engage with different cities, and everything is an opportunity for us. But architecture shouldn't sit back and be timid and be less empowered to try and engage with people and to create dynamic spaces which are contemporary and life-affirming.
Just asking it on a global basis, you know, that poverty has a very low level of building. Okay, so urbanism is driven by the favelas, you know. So half of the population will go to poverty. That is the main issue. I'm not very good at the numbers, but this is an issue. And what I'm thinking about that, if we, in the modern world or the advanced world, can do a better housing, a better living, a better architecture, a high-end architecture, compared to the people in poverty, can it be a good way on a global basis to really reach the goal that you have at the beginning of your presentation?
So, sorry, you'll have to. So
I just switched over to my Mac at certain point. So the question is, if we can make an advanced architecture, will this be, let's say, a developing force for the lower part of the architecture?
You would hope so. I had a client yesterday who put it quite a good way in terms of the proliferation of technology. That if you imagined at the beginning, nobody had mobile phones or Apple phones, and now so many do, and that luxury becomes a necessity, was the way that he put it. And I think it's age-old, centuries-old, the connection between architecture and power and those with money and those who commission. And it's obviously, we would wish many things, and we try to show, and we try to push clients that even if they're doing a private project, that there is a civic aspect to it, that they are aware of the civic aspect, and I think the whole sustainability aspect of that is now becoming the key civic aspect of whatever you do. But in terms of having good quality housing for everybody, of course, I mean, we would all wish for this, but we're not being asked to do that. I mean, we can only respond to what we're being asked to do. And we have engaged with the subject, if that's the question. In some countries, it's part of what you do. So in England, it's part of how social housing is delivered. It's part of the price that a private developer pays. In different countries, it's different. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think for me, I know it's a big statement about globalization, and I'm not an economist, but I do see this kind of purist argument and reductive argument against aviation, and not that I'm going to stand and fight to the death on aviation, but there is complexities in all of these parts of globalization, and it has. I mean, it's quite self-evident when you see the change in in parts of Asia what globalization has done for them. Of course, there's been costs to that, costs mainly in the West. But I think that there is factors involved there. And all my point was that we shouldn't get so purist about this. We can't afford to be purist. We need to engage with clients. We need to engage with cultures and people and help them by small steps. And we're not going to get there by big statements, which is just going to lock us out of the room, and we're not going to be asked to be involved.
Yes, absolutely. And I have a idea that it is sometimes too much that architects try to achieve on our own, I would say. So a lot of responsibility lies on the client's side. So maybe they should understand what the impact of the building truly is. So maybe this is the turning point where we can reach a better outcome.
Agreed, absolutely. I think for certain we have been at fault in the past in not raising the subjects and not showing the data and showing the consequences of decisions. But there is also a context within which a client sits. It has to worry about its investment, about its future tenants. But I mean, I think the most optimistic thing, and I know it's done for political reasons, but for China to state that it's going to be net zero by 2060, and for what is effectively becoming the largest economy in the world with the largest population, that is a humongous statement of intent. And it will flow down into the built environment in terms of what they expect from it and how they expect to achieve it. So, and I think we've seen that with the way that they've delivered high-speed rail and all of the infrastructure and the leaps and bounds with which that nation has come about. So, and out of that will flow many other political, didn't Japan also recently start to talk about a similar commitment? And I think all of that is really something to be celebrated, because it starts to put, of course, we would all love a statutory requirement that makes it absolutely impossible for clients to do anything but the right thing. But at the moment, that doesn't exist. But we are starting to see it, hopefully, with large countries like China really seeing the opportunity and the commitment towards, particularly on the net zero commitments that needed to be made. And actually, I would say now the onus needs to come back onto the West to be making similar commitments, because I don't see them at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. And this is an interesting situation when China takes the lead towards such a unique question where you would think that China would be the last one to make such a commitment, and now he is the leading one.
Well, I think I agree, but I think we have seen by just working out there that once they make these decisions, they really start to implement them. And of course, you could implement this in many different ways. There may be, and there's much detail to be yet sorted out in terms of what they mean by net zero and how they get there, and how much offsetting or compensation is going to be involved, or how much nuclear energy is going to be involved. I mean, of course, probably the best performer in the world is probably France, isn't it? Because of their complete domination in their market with nuclear energy. So I know it's not straightforward, but I think China does have a lot, for all its faults, it has immense ambition and optimism, and it has immense ability to turn and suddenly face a direction and start implementing. And I think that, given its stature, its growing stature in the world, particularly that it's turned to this issue, without knowing exactly how they're going to get there, I think that's still an immense statement and something to be really welcomed.
Can I say something here? Hello.
Hello, Jakob. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's. I like the presentation. Obviously, you're talking the same language as what we're trying to do here, in Paris. That's why we called our presentation Adaptable City. And I think a lot of the points that you're making are very, very good points. Architecture is not easy, you know? I mean, ironically, it's almost sometimes you wonder whether it's kind of almost counterproductive, you know, towards towards meeting all of these goals. You know, one would think maybe the most non-polluting thing is to actually not build. And you know, of course, I think it's extremely difficult in a way to put all the answers, you know, trying to get all of them together. And I think your presentation shows that. You know, but what's interesting in it is that you're showing what you're trying to do, you know, and what you're trying to aim for, and the different concerns. And I think today, as an architect, I think for all of the architects in the world, we should absolutely be looking at all of these issues in our own practices. They are contradictory issues. They are challenging issues. None of us have come up with, in a sense, you know, we're coming up with bits and pieces of answers. And I think one's aware of that, you know, in the presentation. I think I'm aware of it in our own work. But I think these challenges are the challenges of right now and where we're headed. And I think it's vital that you know, the architects of the world really start to look at these issues completely seriously and use them as a not as a negative thing, but as an extremely potentially creative source of architecture. So anyway, I just wanted to add, you know, a kind of answer from France, from Paris, and commend the presentation as well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's I think I wanted to be at pains to point out that I don't have the answers, and
exactly. And I think that's where we are all there. We've come through a period of a lot of formal, in a way, experimentation in architecture. We have come through a period of incredibly rich language development, where and being given incredible freedoms with and abilities, I should say, capacities with the digital revolution. But we're in a different space today. And it's a kind of a refinding space right now. And I think that's what we're all aware of.
Yes, couldn't agree more.
And it seems obvious that we won't have an easy answer. So
yeah, no. That's the challenge, because if we did have an answer immediately on the screen, then do you know what I mean? It wouldn't be, you wouldn't be placing the question, and we wouldn't be, putting these issues out. And I think that's where we're at right now. I think there's a lot of challenges out there, and we're trying to come up with answers. But it's not easy, and it can be contradictory and very challenging. And I think that's where we're at. And I think hence your question. But the exciting thing to say about all of that is it's actually a very experimental moment, and I think in architecture we should totally take that as a very rich, very interesting moment, and so we should really be taking that in a very positive way.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think. Architects are always complaining about their lack of agency, and looking back in the past and believing that architects in the 60s had particular agency and that we no longer have it. And I agree completely that this is a real opportunity, but I think we talk about it as a positive thing. And if we get too Puritan. I mean, I agree with this contradiction that if you didn't build anything, you wouldn't be creating carbon impacts. But the fact is, we are going to keep growing as a population. We are going to have to keep growing as an economy in some form. And we all want to keep living and affording things and doing things. And that's the reality that has to be factored into this. So
it's absolutely right. You know, your whole discussion on the concrete. I remember being in Oslo on a conference and being sort of indirectly told that, you know, if one built out of concrete, it was a crime. And I cannot agree with you more on this. You know, with the concrete is an extraordinary material. It's a modern, contemporary, and will be in the future material. And what's interesting is what we're doing now is we're challenging it as a traditional, you know, the way of using it, creating a lot of pollution in making it, and we're challenging it with green versions of the concrete, recycling. You know, there's a lot of interesting experimentation. It's not all there right now, but the material is not going to die overnight, and its use, we should not think that it's going to be put to the side. I think your point is extremely good on that, and I would, you know, only second it.
It's interesting, actually, when we did the Aquatic Centre in London, and the structural engineer was talking about the use of GGBS, you suddenly discover that there's this whole byproduct being piling up in Cornwall that came from the potteries industry, which
wow.
must be, and it's called the Cornish Alps, and it's all this fly ash that has just been sitting there waiting for a use. And of course, and there must be so much more of that, and there must be so much more experimentation and technology that can turn waste products into useful materials that we can use in our built environment.
Absolutely. And that's what's interesting now, because we're asked to accountability, as you say, and it's done through calculations. We never had to do this kind of thing before. And it's good. It's a good thing. It takes a lot more work, but in doing so, I think it will help us also experiment and find new ways of making architecture.
Absolutely. And it'll turn us into engineers, won't it?
Creative engineers.
Or ecologists, because there is an issue if we put a lot of engineering work to decide whether to keep one material or to keep it and throw it away. And now the reality in my practice is that it is still cheaper, for example, to completely get rid of stone pavement and build a new one, bringing the material from, example, China or whatever. And it is still cheaper to get a totally new material, and it is stone, so you could reuse it.
But have you been asked to do a calculation based on carbon footprint, bringing it from China to Hungary? And have you been asked for a calculation based on reusing local stonework in terms of, you know, local employment, keeping resources close to home, etc.? And have you been asked to give those to the client and show what's better in the long term?
No, not yet. We are just ahead of it.
No, I think my hunch is that, you know, that's what we're really saying here, is that the architect now is asked for those calculations. Certainly our clients in France are asking for that accountability. And it's becoming a huge issue. And I think in the long term, those calculations, if you really look into them in their full implication, you'll find that China doesn't look interesting. And you'll find that the local market looks extremely interesting.
Yeah, if we sort out the priorities, absolutely, yes.
And I think that's a very good example of where I think we should absolutely be heading. If we're not doing it, other people are. It's not just the architects, you know?
Okay. That was a quite good debate. Just.
Yes, thank you.
At the end of the conference, traditional, I have a question for you. What is your message for the young?
The world is theirs. So they have everything to look forward to, and I think it's an amazing moment. I think when I was entering into college, all the pessimism around the Cold War, I wasn't that old, but at the end of the Cold War, and into a recession, and I think it's kind of similar in the sense of there potentially will be some type of dip coming. But I think there's, as we were just discussing, there's a huge moment of change coming for our industry and the world at large, and and they will be the future leaders of this. So it's a real moment of ability to participate and to make that change.
Okay, thank you, Jakob.
Yeah, McFarlane, not Jacob, but that's okay. I think the same thing. I think there's two very recent things that have happened in the last couple of days. We woke up and found that we have a 90% effective vaccine, I should say, that's been developed. That's pretty amazing and that's pretty exciting. That's a short-term thing, but it's an extremely interesting thing because it represents a medical breakthrough in the way that we're using reworked DNA to fight the virus. And that's never been done before in the history of medicine. So it represents a new breakthrough in the way we are using science and technology to come up with an answer in 6 months, which is an incredibly short period of time to come up with a vaccine, and which apparently is 90% effective compared to what needs to be at least 50% effective. So I think that's an incredibly positive foot forward in a period when we've had a lot of, self-doubt, doubters countries, doubt around the world. So, combined, I would say that's a great message about, we need to pay attention to the science. It's a period that I think we're entering into, which is hence the whole discussion on calculations and accountability, using the right materials, I would say that will, anyway, I think that's a positive short-term message, which has big implications in terms of the right use of science and working across, bringing all the talent of the planet to work together. That was an American-German project, but was using other cultures to work on the calculations. So I think it's an amazing national project that brought up, that came up with a vaccine in such a short period of time. I think the world, in terms of architecture, we're heading into an incredibly productive period, which is alluded to a little bit in this last talk, which is why I liked it as well. In architecture, I think we need to be working together. We need to be working across cultures. It's one culture. It's not a separate series of countries. And I would like to then add that to just the results of the American elections, because I think that would be another thing which has just happened, let's say, in the last few days, which I think is also incredibly positive. I think two positive things happened on the same day. One is that, the new transitional government in America had their first meeting on COVID, and on the same day we had the announcement that there was a vaccine. And I think they're great steps forward. And it's not about politics, and it's not about medicine. It's also very much about architecture and your future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Balázs?
To have the same question to be answered?
Please.
Well, I think that it is quite clear that everybody wants to leave a trace somehow. So when a young man becomes an architect or just decides that he wants to be an architect, there is a wanting that you want to leave a trace, and that's what should be a little bit rethinked. That maybe the next generation should learn, or our generation now should learn how not to leave a trace, how stay calm and stay healthy, but it doesn't mean that you should stop living. I'm not talking about that. Mm-hmm. But all this effort that drive people to do something should be placed on an ethical basis. Mm. And I think now more than ever, architecture should be a bridge between the larger issues and the smaller acts that what the people can do in his life. So maybe this is my message.
Nice message. Good message.
Thank you.
You here.
So this is the end of the conference for today. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope to see you tomorrow to our next conference for V4 countries. Will be a conference in Krakow. We'll start at 2 p.m. with very nice speakers and very good lectures. Thank you very much to the Hungarian Chamber of Architects, to the Budapest Chamber of Architects. Thank you very much to the President of the Budapest Chamber of Architects, Mr. Balázs Csapó. And thank you very much to all the participants today, all the speakers and supporters for this conference. Thank you very much. If you have a message for the finishing or not, we can close the conference here.
Well, simply thanks very much for having us. It was very enjoyable, very interesting. And I look forward to the next couple of days watching.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. See you.